Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? The most misunderstood Lovecraftian god and why it matters is not just a title. It's a warning hidden in plain sight. Because among Lovecraft's many horrors, gods of slime, void, and madness, one stands apart, not for being forgotten, but for being misread. While others slumber at the edge of space, this one walks among us, speaking in symbols we almost understand. And that misunderstanding may be the most dangerous thing of all. What if the creature we've called a trickster, a messenger, even a villain, was something much worse? Not evil, but intelligent. Not chaos, but clarity so sharp it splits the mind. He doesn't destroy worlds, he rewrites them. This is not about monsters with too many eyes or names no one can pronounce. It's about the quiet collapse of certainty. The terrifying idea that what speaks clearly is not speaking to you, but through you. To trace this, God's origins is to pull on a thread that leads through collapsing empires, forgotten languages, and ideas that should never have taken shape. And yet, here they are. So we begin. Slowly, carefully, because once this figure takes shape in your thoughts, he tends to stay. And what follows is not revelation, but erosion. Let's look back before we fall forward. Before Nyarlathotep appeared in print, something was already changing in Lovecraft's world. The year was 1920. The First World War had just ended, leaving behind a generation of disillusioned thinkers. Traditional belief systems, religion, progress, even reason itself had been shaken. Across Europe and America, confidence in human mastery over nature was eroding. Lovecraft, a man shaped by Enlightenment values and cosmic pessimism, turned inward. In a letter to Reinhard Kleiner, he described a dream in which a mysterious figure, Nyarlathotep, moved through cities, delivering a message no one could understand, but everyone feared. This wasn't a god in the traditional sense. It was a rupture in meaning. The dream arrived during a time when Lovecraft's personal beliefs were undergoing transformation. He admired scientific rationalism, but feared where it led. Astronomy had pushed Earth to the edge of the cosmos. Biology had dismantled divine creation. What remained was a vast, impersonal universe, and now, a voice from its depths. Nyarlathotep emerged not from myth or doctrine, but from a psychological fracture. He wasn't an invention of folklore or scripture. He was a response to a crisis of knowing, shaped by modernity's collapse of certainty. That collapse was not fictional, it was historical. And Lovecraft, through dream and pen, gave it a face. When scholars discuss cosmic horror, they often focus on the unknowable. But Nyarlathotep doesn't merely represent the unknown. He speaks, he performs, he invites. His presence demands engagement, not avoidance. This is key. Traditional, monstrous gods, like Cthulhu or Azathoth, remain silent, their horror rooted in incomprehension. Nyarlathotep turns horror into communication. He offers clarity that unravels rather than explains. That shift, from silence to speech, marks a philosophical break. It implies that the danger isn't ignorance, it's misunderstanding. And this is where historical context matters. The early 20th century wasn't just about new horrors. It was about false clarity, propaganda, charismatic demagogues, scientific overreach. Nyarlathotep doesn't threaten with chaos. He threatens with meaning. Several strands of cultural influence feed into Nyarlathotep's creation. Theosophy, popular at the time, reimagined ancient deities as cosmic forces guiding humanity's evolution. But Lovecraft inverts this. His messenger doesn't elevate consciousness. it distorts it. Emerson's transcendentalism viewed nature as divine and knowable. Lovecraft turned that vision into a mockery, portraying nature as empty, uncaring, and populated by intelligences that do not share our moral frameworks. Nietzsche's death of God echoes in the background, but Lovecraft goes further. Not only is God dead, something else is answering in his place. Each of these influences builds a backdrop where Nyarlathotep isn't a parody of God's past. He's their logical replacement in a disenchanted world. Language is one of Nyarlathotep's most overlooked weapons. His very name feels ancient, yet it's a linguistic invention. It mimics the phonetic patterns of Egyptian or Mesopotamian gods, but no historical precedent exists. This is intentional. The name invites false recognition. Readers assume ancient origin, but no such entity appears in any text before Lovecraft's. This pseudo-etymology mirrors the god's role within the mythos, to present as meaningful while hollowing out that meaning. Even his titles, the crawling chaos, the black pharaoh, the faceless god, operate not as descriptions, but as destabilizers. They create resonance, not understanding. This reveals something profound. Nyarlathotep functions as a semiotic trap. What seems like information is misdirection. The symbolic weight of Nyarlathotep lies in his multiplicity. Unlike other beings in the mythos, he wears faces, thousands, perhaps infinite. But each mask functions not as concealment, but as misalignment. He shows what people expect to see. In this, he embodies a concept closer to ideology than theology. He adjusts to cultural weakness, becoming what each era cannot defend against. In a religious society, he becomes the prophet. In a scientific age, he becomes the theorist. He doesn't deceive. He reflects, then corrupts. The idea of a crawling chaos is not about movement across space, but infiltration across systems, belief, logic, culture. Authenticity in Lovecraft's mythos depends not on facts, but on texture. Nyarlathotep is embedded in dreamlike discontinuities, often appearing in stories that abandon traditional structure. He operates outside narrative norms, reflecting the instability he brings. When he does appear, texts often shift, disintegrating into hallucination, memory loss, or apocalyptic revelation. His myth is built on psychological familiarity, not historical plausibility. This is why readers often misread him. He feels ancient, he feels important, but he exists in the fractures, not the records. The use of invented tomes, the Necronomicon, the Pinacotic manuscripts, reinforces this. Knowledge is present, but poisoned. The stories mimic historical structure to deliver anti-historical content. We must pause here, because this figure, shaped by modern anxiety, voiced through false symbols, and clothed in invented history, sets the stage for a deeper philosophical horror. In the next section, we will examine the nature of that horror, not just what Nyarlathotep is, but what he means, not merely his place among the entities of Lovecraft's mythos, but how he disturbs the very act of knowing. Let us continue. In attempting to grasp Nyarlathotep's origins, we must turn not to mythology, but to the philosophical ruins of modernity. Where earlier cultures personified storms and oceans to make sense of their terror, Lovecraft builds Nyarlathotep from ideas. His presence grows from the intellectual soil of Western collapse, where Enlightenment reason, religious authority, and humanism began to fail, and something colder seeped in. This god does not explain natural phenomena. He undermines the impulse to explain. The shift is crucial. Previous deities offered answers, whether merciful or wrathful. Nyarlathotep removes the questioner. Philosophically, his clearest ancestors are not gods, but principles. Consider entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, which tells us that systems move toward disorder. Nyarlathotep represents a different form of entropy, one of meaning. Where Cthulhu slumbers beneath oceans, Nyarlathotep circulates in systems of thought, accelerating collapse not by destruction, but by communication. He mimics language, he mimics knowledge, but what he brings is rot disguised as clarity, and in this, he reflects modern fears. Not monsters, but systems that fail while claiming progress. Ideologies, bureaucracies, technologies. 3 intellectual traditions feed directly into this construction: nihilism, romanticism, and anti-theism. From Nietzsche, Lovecraft borrows a world where divine purpose has vanished. From romanticism, he inherits awe before the sublime, awe twisted into terror when the sublime becomes active and malevolent. And from anti-theism, he rejects not only belief in gods, but the entire premise that divinity implies benevolence. Nyarlathotep is not evil. He is unmoored from moral categories. That indifference masquerading as intention is what makes him intolerable. He isn't the devil. He's the imposter of meaning itself. Nyarlathotep also operates as a response to the failure of sacred narrative. In earlier cosmologies, even cruel gods had a role. They fit within a moral framework, however distant. But this being performs the role of divine messenger without offering any theological structure. He arrives, he speaks, he leaves devastation. But his revelations explain nothing. They corrupt the urge to explain. In this, he echoes the Gnostic demiurge, not as creator, but as the one who blocks real understanding. The ancient Gnostics believed that true knowledge was hidden behind a false god. Lovecraft removes even the hope of hidden truth. Nyarlathotep doesn't conceal the divine. He reveals that there was nothing there to begin with. Another cultural ancestor lies in the figure of the trickster, but here too the comparison unravels. Trickster gods, Loki, Hermes, Anansi, subvert order, but often within a known cosmology. Their chaos is productive, generative. Nyarlathotep's trickery dismantles the tools of comprehension. His lies are not misdirections. They are structural breakdowns disguised as insight. Readers drawn to him often mistake this for cleverness, but cleverness implies an internal logic. His actions suggest logic only to erode it. The error is believing he has a goal. He is function without intent, a formula that generates collapse. We must consider, too, the impact of early 20th century media theory. This was the age when mass communication became a new force of persuasion. Radio, cinema, the newspaper column, these reshaped truth into performance. Nyarlathotep's persona, especially in the original prose poem, mirrors the charismatic orator who travels city to city, mesmerizing crowds with visions they cannot comprehend. He doesn't silence them, he overwhelms them. This anticipates the modern fear of information without context, of content that spreads faster than meaning. Lovecraft, perhaps without knowing, captures the shape of a force that would dominate the next century. Narrative, disintegration under the guise of knowledge. All of these traditions converge in a figure who exploits the moment when humans lose faith in their frameworks. He emerges not when belief is strong, but when belief has failed and reason cannot fill the gap. In this way, he is not a god in the classical sense. He is what appears when gods are no longer believed in, but their place in the psyche remains vacant. That psychological space, empty yet expectant, becomes his temple. What follows from this is more than myth. It is a challenge to epistemology itself, because once language, logic, and memory are suspect, what remains? As we transition into the next subsection, we must examine how even Nyarlathotep's name participates in this erosion. Not just as a label, but as a linguistic virus, a symbol that sounds true and feels ancient, but resists all meaning. Let us look more closely at what happens when a god is built not from history, but from the failure of interpretation. The name Nyarlathotep carries the cadence of ancient speech. It mimics the morphology of Egyptian or Mesopotamian deities, long, winding, and full of phonetic gravity. But no such name exists in any recorded pantheon. This is not an oversight. It is a deliberate construction meant to trigger false recognition. The name operates like a cultural parasite. It attaches itself to imagined history, feeding on the listener's assumption that it must be old. The illusion of etymology is itself the mechanism of horror. It doesn't matter that the name means nothing. It matters that it feels like it should. Unlike Cthulhu, whose name is intentionally unpronounceable and alien, Nyarlathotep's name invites engagement. It almost welcomes the tongue. This accessibility conceals its deeper function. It isn't a name at all. It's a linguistic lure. Saying it aloud feels transgressive, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it implies, that the cosmos can be named, mapped, spoken into, understanding. But here lies the trap. This name offers structure where there is none. It provides a false linguistic anchor in a mythos that thrives on drift. We must pause here, because this is the first sign that Nyarlathotep is not merely a character. He is an operation within language. Titles such as the Crawling Chaos, the Black Pharaoh, and the Faceless God do not clarify him. They multiply him. Each evokes a distinct archetype: movement, royalty, anonymity. Yet none provide definition. Instead, they serve as shifting semantic veils. The titles create resonance without identity. They offer interpretation without stability. Crawling Chaos sounds descriptive, but the word chaos in Lovecraft is not disorder. It is the absence of ontological anchoring. And crawling does not refer to motion through space. It suggests contagion, permeation, drift. The title does not describe what he is. It shows how he functions. This ambiguity creates a linguistic feedback loop. Scholars and fans attempt to parse his name, his titles, his meanings. But each attempt creates more questions than answers. This is not because Nyarlathotep is vague. It's because he is linguistically weaponized. Language collapses under his weight, not due to excess, but due to inversion. Every familiar symbol points in the wrong direction. Consider this carefully. Nyarlathotep is not content to exist beyond language. He infects it. His danger lies not in what he hides, but in how he uses familiar terms to hollow them out. In this way, he reflects a broader anxiety of the modern world, the unreliability of symbols. As structuralist thinkers would later suggest, language does not connect cleanly to the world. It mediates, distorts, misleads. Lovecraft anticipates this by crafting a being who uses linguistic form, but strips it of its referent. The result is a symbol that generates false epistemology. To speak Nyarlathotep's name is to engage in an act of self-deception. The name offers participation. The consequence is destabilization. There is a reason he is rarely encountered directly in stories. His most powerful appearances come in dreams, in fragmentary visions, in corrupt texts. When he is present, narrative structure weakens. When he speaks, coherence fractures. His relationship to language mimics the experience of reading a text in translation, where key terms remain undefined. the reader continues, assuming context will clarify, but it never does. This deliberate semiotic failure reinforces his role as anti-messenger. He brings words. The words mean nothing, and yet they echo. This use of symbolic language is also what sets him apart from other mythological figures. Traditional gods accrue meaning over time through ritual and repetition. Nyarlathotep reverses this. He is introduced fully formed, already embedded in false antiquity. His mythology is retroactive. His symbols suggest roots that do not exist. And yet, because they feel consistent, they generate legitimacy. This is the paradox. He is not ancient, but he functions like something ancient, which in Lovecraft's framework is more dangerous than being old. It means he can bypass skepticism. In this collapse of etymology and symbol, we see a broader theme: authenticity without foundation. This is the condition Nyarlathotep creates wherever he moves. It is not ignorance, it is false familiarity. As we shift now to the final section of Part 1, we must examine how Lovecraft crafted a myth around this entity, how he embedded the illusion of truth into fictional texts and rituals, creating not just a character, but a false archaeological record. And in doing so, he made Nyarlathotep not simply a god of fiction, but a function within myth itself. Lovecraft understood something essential about belief, that it does not require truth, only texture. The mythos surrounding Nyarlathotep was never presented as canon, yet it feels strangely authentic. That effect is not accidental. It's the result of careful narrative design, fragments, forged texts, conflicting accounts. Unlike traditional mythology, which builds through accumulation and coherence, Lovecraft's method was subversive. He scattered partial truths across disconnected tales, encouraging the illusion of a shared ancient tradition. Readers didn't learn about Nyarlathotep through a single authoritative myth. They discovered him indirectly through corrupted memories, secondary sources, and damaged manuscripts. This is how belief survives even when meaning collapses. Consider the Necronomicon, Menacodic manuscripts, and Book of Ibon, all fabricated texts Lovecraft invoked to lend credibility to his mythos. They read like real books because they mimic the language of scholarship. Citations, translations, anonymous editors, all tools Lovecraft borrowed from academic discourse. But their contents are unreadable, unstable, often contradictory. This reveals something profound. The appearance of truth can be engineered without truth itself. Nyarlathotep becomes believable not because of narrative coherence, but because of referential density. The more often his name is mentioned across unrelated contexts, the more it resembles inherited lore. This strategy echoes real-world esoteric traditions. Gnostic texts, Hermetic writings, and apocryphal scriptures often survive as fragments, mistranslations, or deliberate obfuscations. Their authority comes not from clarity, but from mystery. Lovecraft adopted this pattern to create a myth that feels older than it is. Nyarlathotep appears scattered across dreams, cult rituals, and fictional histories, not to create understanding, but to simulate the process of researching a forgotten truth. That simulation creates investment, and the god, as a result, becomes more real through uncertainty than he ever could through direct exposition. This myth-building technique allows Lovecraft to bypass traditional storytelling constraints. Nyarlathotep doesn't need a definitive origin, a full narrative arc, or consistent traits. His identity is distributed. Some stories portray him as a figure of science. Others cast him as religious avatar. A few reduce him to a rumor. But this fragmentation doesn't weaken him, it strengthens him. The inconsistency becomes thematic. He is not one thing. He is the collapse of the idea that things must be one thing. This structural ambiguity makes him a perfect carrier for cosmic horror, a presence that degrades every system it enters, including narrative itself. This fragmentation also invites participation. Readers and writers alike begin to speculate, reconstruct, reinterpret. Unlike mythologies that resist alteration, the Nyarlathotep myth invites contamination. It functions like folklore in a postmodern setting, open source, self-replicating, and unstable. Even August Derleth's later attempt to systematize the mythos failed to contain Nyarlathotep's ambiguity. Attempts to classify him as evil or associate him with an elemental force only emphasized how resistant he was to taxonomy. Every effort to define him ends up feeding his complexity. In this sense, the god grows through misreading. A final feature of his mythic presence is its uncanny familiarity. He appears in dreams, wears human faces, speaks in known languages. Unlike other entities in the mythos, he comes close. And yet, something is always slightly off. The dream feels too vivid. The voice sounds too precise. This closeness is what makes him dangerous. It creates the illusion of connection just long enough to ensure collapse. Myth building here becomes a weapon, not to inspire awe, but to hollow out the frameworks that produce awe. And once hollow, those frameworks remain standing, empty, echoing, and vulnerable to re-inhabitation. What emerges is not a god in the ancient sense, but a mythic function, a mechanism for undermining epistemology, narrative, and belief. Nyarlathotep doesn't just inhabit stories. He infects how stories are told. As we now turn to his deeper nature and themes in Part 2, we must examine what lies beneath this mythic scaffolding. What philosophical concepts shape him? What horrors are revealed in his ability to speak? And what does it mean that he is not just heard, but understood? Let us proceed. Nyarlathotep stands at the intersection of several core philosophical terrors that define cosmic horror. Most central is insignificance. Lovecraft's universe is not built for human comprehension or morality. It functions on scales and principles so far removed from lived experience that meaning becomes a fragile illusion. Nyarlathotep exacerbates this by not simply revealing the scale of human unimportance, but by engaging with it. Unlike the blind, indifferent forces that populate the mythos, he acknowledges us, and in doing so, he confirms that we matter only as objects to be used, misled, or dismantled. His attention is not a blessing, it's a diagnostic. This theme of existential reduction pairs with a second concept, entropy. Not thermodynamic entropy in the mechanical sense, but narrative entropy, the inevitable collapse of structure. Nyarlathotep appears where systems begin to fail. His presence doesn't destroy outright, it unravels. Institutions buckle under his influence. Belief systems corrode. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, his domain is not chaos, but order repurposed as deception. The dreamlands, once fantastical, become sinister as his presence turns logic against itself. His entropy is not fire, it's rot. Slow, internal, and irreversible. He doesn't end worlds. He lets them decay into something unrecognizable. A third core concept is dream-reality collapse. Nyarlathotep often enters through dreams, visions, and subconscious encounters. But unlike typical dream figures, he brings with him permanence. Those who see him in dreams awaken changed, or don't awaken at all. In the prose poem, Nyarlathotep, the narrator describes visions that do not fade. And as I looked upon them, I saw that they were not dreams, for they were more vivid than the reality I knew. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness is not blurred. It's inverted. This inversion mirrors philosophical solipsism, where reality becomes subordinate to perception. But here, the consequence isn't philosophical stasis. It's horror. If dreams can infect waking life, then nothing is stable. These three concepts, insignificance, entropy, and dream collapse, interact to produce what might be called cosmic illegibility. The world no longer offers stable signs. Nyarlathotep doesn't obscure meaning through silence. He overwhelms it with too much signal. This creates a unique epistemological dilemma, not ignorance, but saturation. In a world filled with false information, distorted truth, and unreliable narrators, knowledge itself becomes corrosive. This anticipates modern concerns with information overload and deepfakes. But Lovecraft reaches this anxiety through metaphysics. To know Nyarlathotep is not to encounter data. It is to suffer semantic collapse. Meaning is not destroyed. It is revealed as arbitrary. Consider the shape of his appearances. He is rarely monstrous in the traditional sense. He often appears human, or nearly so. This almost familiarity makes him more unsettling than grotesque gods like Shub-Niggurath or Azathoth. Those entities dwarf understanding through scale and silence. Nyarlathotep imitates understanding. He offers explanations that seem coherent until they are acted upon. His horror lies in mimetic closeness. He is the teacher whose lesson fractures the mind, the priest whose revelation damns the believer, the voice that clarifies until you realize the clarity was a trap. He teaches not by lying, but by letting you believe you've understood. This leads to the question, if Nyarlathotep represents these philosophical threats, why does he choose to speak? Why perform? The answer may lie in the nature of performance itself. A performance invites complicity. The audience consents to observe. They open themselves to interpretation. And Nyarlathotep weaponizes that consent. His words are not aimed at destruction, but at transformation. Once heard, they cannot be unheard. Once grasped, they reshape the listener's internal frameworks. The terror is not what he says. It's what you become after hearing it. As Lovecraft writes, and it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt, speaking much and seeming to say little. That seeming is the key. We must now ask, what kind of figure inserts himself so deliberately into systems of communication? Not a destroyer, but an editor. Not a god of chaos, but a curator of collapse. Nyarlathotep embodies a future where the real is overwritten, not erased. His themes are not ancient. They are recursive, viral, and modern. And they raise a final disturbing implication. The most horrifying force in the universe may not be silence, but speech. Not absence, but presence misunderstood. With these concepts in place, we now turn to the shape of the forces themselves. Who or what accompanies Nyarlathotep in this mythic landscape? What entities stand beside him in the pantheon of cosmic indifference, and how does he differ from them? The next section will explore the nature of the beings that populate this unhuman cosmos, and why Nyarlathotep remains singular among them. Let us continue. Within Lovecraft's imagined cosmos, the pantheon of entities known as the Outer Gods and Great Old Ones do not function like deities in traditional myth. They do not govern, protect, or punish. They are not bound to morality, nor do they reflect human desires. These beings are fundamentally indifferent, some so massive and remote that they are barely conscious, others so alien that even describing them as alive imposes too much structure. In this unfathomable company, Nyarlathotep stands apart. He is not the most powerful nor the most grotesque, but he is the most active. He moves, speaks, deceives. He cares, but never in the way a human mind would hope. Consider Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of all things. He is said to gnaw hungrily in chaos, surrounded by piping flutes and mindless dancers. He is not a character, but a principle, pure entropy without thought or purpose. Nyarlathotep, often described as his messenger, exists in unsettling contrast. He has intellect. He has motive, or at least behavior that imitates it. While Azathoth sleeps, Nyarlathotep walks. While others remain hidden, he intervenes. This distinction is critical. It makes Nyarlathotep the interface between incomprehensible cosmic forces and the human world, a translator whose translations shatter meaning. Unlike Cthulhu, who lies dormant beneath the sea, communicating only through dreams, Nyarlathotep appears directly. His manifestations are not limited to psychic projection or influence. He takes form, multiple forms, sometimes as a pharaoh, sometimes as a faceless god, sometimes as an indistinct presence that speaks from inside the skull. Each appearance is tailored, contextual, deceptive, strategic. He adjusts to culture and expectation. This fluidity marks a radical departure from the fixed identities of other mythos beings. Where others symbolize what cannot be known, Nyarlathotep represents what pretends to be known. That difference is not cosmetic, it is the horror itself. His relationship to the dreamlands also sets him apart. Most mythos entities exist outside dream space or influence it passively. Nyarlathotep rules there. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he is the final barrier between the dreamer and the gods. But he is not a guardian. He is the one who ensures the dream becomes indistinguishable from nightmare. His presence in the dreamland suggests not a separate plane, but a membrane, a place where perception and reality collapse into one another. He becomes the custodian of that collapse. He enforces no boundaries because boundaries are his tools. There are beings in Lovecraft's corpus that mimic Nyarlathotep's structure superficially. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods, has multiplicity. Yog-Sothoth is said to be coexistent with all time and space. But they lack agency. They do not choose. Nyarlathotep does, or appears to. This simulation of free will is uniquely horrifying. If he chooses to act, then he chooses to manipulate, to speak, to appear. And if that is true, then he cannot be explained away as natural force. He is something worse, an intelligence fully aware of human vulnerability and eager to exploit it for ends that remain opaque. This is why cults form around him in the mythos, not because he demands worship, but because he permits it. He allows belief to fester. He offers visions and revelations, but no doctrine. Worship becomes a trap without exit. Kandi'i ansadi, feedback loop where the more one believes, the less one understands. In the haunter of the dark, the church that houses his influence becomes a site of both fascination and psychic disintegration. His presence lingers not in miracles, but in symbols. An artifact, a light, a whisper, and those symbols corrode the believer from within. He does not reward faith. He exploits its machinery. This brings us to a final distinction. Nyarlathotep is not simply a god among others. He is a force of mediation. His function is to move between realms, real and unreal, divine and human, known and unknowable. And in doing so, he does not clarify. He poisons the very act of crossing. He is the corridor that leads nowhere, the emissary who distorts the message, the bridge that collapses as you walk it. His uniqueness lies in the fact that while the others exist, Nyarlathotep arrives. As we move now into the next layer of horror, we must ask, what happens when a human being interacts with such a force? What happens not to the body, but to the mind, when Nyarlathotep enters thought, language, and belief? If he is the only God who speaks, what is the cost of listening? Let us examine how human madness is not a side effect, but a design. Human interaction with Nyarlathotep rarely follows the pattern of confrontation. There is no battle, no resistance, no moment where a character stands against him and survives intact. The encounter is quieter and more devastating. It begins with attention. Nyarlathotep notices. That alone is enough to destabilize the human subject, because attention implies relevance, and relevance implies a role in something far larger than the self can contain. Madness, in this framework, is not a punishment. It is a consequence of contact. Lovecraft consistently frames insanity not as emotional breakdown, but as cognitive overload. Characters exposed to Nyarlathotep do not panic immediately. They begin by understanding too much. In the prose poem, Nyarlathotep, crowds gather willingly, drawn by demonstrations and speeches that promise revelation. The narrator does not describe terror at first, but fascination. Only later does the cost emerge. Cities collapse into silence. People wander without memory, and the world becomes unrecognizable. This sequence matters. Madness does not arrive through fear. It arrives through comprehension exceeding capacity. This pattern distinguishes Nyarlathotep from other cosmic entities. Cthulhu induces madness through dreams that bypass reason. Yog-Sothoth dissolves identity through temporal infinity. Nyarlathotep operates differently. He works through rational structures. He speaks in language. He presents ideas. He uses mathematics, prophecy, and demonstration. In the dreams in the witch house, his influence is tied to non-Euclidean geometry and advanced mathematics, fields associated with intellect, not superstition. The implication is precise. Sanity fails not because the mind is weak, but because it is working correctly within a reality that no longer obeys human limits. Madness here functions as a diagnostic state. It reveals the incompatibility between human cognition and cosmic truth. Those who encounter Nyarlathotep often realize that the categories they relied on, cause and effect, self and other, dream and waking, were provisional all along. Once that realization occurs, recovery is impossible, not because the mind is broken, but because it has adapted. This reveals something profound. Madness is not the opposite of knowledge. It is what knowledge becomes when stripped of protective illusion. Nyarlathotep's role in this process is active. He does not merely expose forbidden truths. He stages them. He engineers circumstances where individuals believe they are discovering something independently. This illusion of agency deepens the collapse. Characters think they are learning. In reality, they are being guided toward epistemic failure. Consider the recurring motif of invitation. Lectures attended, dreams entered willingly, doors opened out of curiosity. Nyarlathotep does not force entry. He waits for consent, and once granted, he ensures that the subject completes their own undoing. We must pause here, because this consent complicates the moral structure of the mythos. The victims are not innocents in the traditional sense. They are seekers, scholars, dreamers, thinkers. Their curiosity is not framed as sin, but it is framed as vulnerability. Nyarlathotep exploits the human need for coherence. He offers patterns. He offers explanations. And each explanation removes another layer of psychological insulation. What collapses is not sanity alone, but trust in perception itself. The aftermath of these encounters is often understated. Lovecraft does not dwell on screaming or institutionalization. Instead, he describes silence, withdrawal, or disappearance. Characters vanish from society, retreat into muteness, or exist in a state of permanent dislocation. This restraint is deliberate. Madness here is not spectacle. It is absence. The individual no longer participates in shared reality. They may still function biologically, but socially and cognitively, they are gone. Nyarlathotep does not create lunatics. He creates exiles from meaning. This function of madness also serves a narrative purpose. It preserves mystery. Those who understand cannot explain. Those who could explain are no longer accessible. Knowledge becomes self-sealing. This ensures that Nyarlathotep's influence spreads without resolution. Rumors replace testimony. Fragments replace accounts. The reader is left with traces rather than answers. And that, too, mirrors the human experience of encountering systems too complex to master. As we move forward, this pattern raises a deeper question. If madness is not an accident, but an outcome, what kind of knowledge produces it? What truths are so corrosive that understanding them dismantles the mind that understands? In the next section, we will confront this directly by examining forbidden knowledge itself, not as hidden information, but as a process that collapses the possibility of knowing. Forbidden knowledge, in Lovecraft's cosmos, is not hidden in the traditional sense. It is not buried treasure or encrypted code waiting to be deciphered. It is knowledge that destabilizes the knower. Nyarlathotep does not conceal truth. He offers it, freely, seductively, precisely because it cannot be integrated. He represents the moment when comprehension becomes disintegration, when awareness destroys the framework that makes awareness possible. In this, forbidden knowledge is not a substance. It is a function, and it functions through epistemic collapse. This collapse occurs when categories fail. Human understanding depends on oppositions, dream versus waking, subject versus object, real versus imagined. Nyarlathotep's revelations blur these lines until they are meaningless. In The Haunter of the Dark, the shining trapezohedron serves as a medium of vision. The protagonist sees across dimensions, but what he sees does not bring insight. It induces paralysis. The knowledge revealed is not communicable, not because it is too vast, but because it dismantles the very grammar of communication. The words don't fail. The structure that makes words meaningful fails. What makes Nyarlathotep's knowledge especially corrosive is that it arrives in familiar form. Scientific lectures, ritual incantations, philosophical insight, each appears to offer structure. But what they structure is an abyss. His knowledge mimics coherence, right up to the moment of collapse. Consider this carefully. He does not tempt with secrets. He tempts with clarity. The horror comes not from mystery, but from the realization that mystery was never there, that everything was false clarity masking a deeper non-truth. This reverses the traditional horror arc. In most supernatural fiction, knowledge dispels fear. The more we learn, the more we understand, the less we fear. Nyarlathotep flips this. The more we learn, the more fear becomes appropriate. The final horror is not ignorance. It is understanding that knowledge has no stable object. To know Nyarlathotep is to know that truth is not fixed, that reality does not conform to logic, and that perception is a trap constructed by evolution, not reason. This kind of knowledge undoes the self by eroding its foundation. Lovecraft's characters who survive Nyarlathotep's revelations often suffer from what can only be described as ontological dislocation. They lose not their memories, but the meaning of those memories. Their past becomes unintelligible because their framework for interpretation has collapsed. In philosophical terms, they experience a rupture in the phenomenological field. Being remains, but meaning is absent. They are alive, but they no longer inhabit a human world. This process can be compared to the concept of hyperstition, a term used in postmodern theory to describe ideas that create their own reality by being believed. Nyarlathotep's knowledge behaves similarly. Once introduced, it does not require proof. It spreads through interpretation, reshaping the cognitive landscape around it. A character may begin by investigating a symbol or artifact, but that investigation is not a search. It is a contamination. The more it is studied, the more it transforms the one who studies it. The revelation is not at the end. The revelation is the process itself. This is why epistemic collapse is so central to his horror. It isn't that there are things humans were not meant to know. It's that the act of knowing itself is flawed, fragile, and weaponizable. Nyarlathotep exploits the gap between sensation and reality, between language and world. He does not break the mind. He reveals the mind to be already broken, already insufficient. And once revealed, it cannot return to unawareness. The damage is permanent. The implications of this are profound. If forbidden knowledge is not concealed but always available, just beyond perception, just beneath thought, then the question is not whether one will find it, but whether one can avoid it. And in Nyarlathotep's case, the answer is often no. He is not hidden. He is waiting. He appears when systems begin to falter, when belief decays, when logic fractures, when meaning slips. He enters, not as a destroyer, but as the next stage in cognition. As we prepare to trace these ideas through literary history in Part 3, we must ask, how did Nyarlathotep first appear in fiction? What structures did Lovecraft use to embed this philosophical horror into narrative form? And how did others take up the mantle, intentionally or not, expanding his myth while often misunderstanding its depth? The literary record holds more than stories. It holds a map of collapse. Let us begin to follow it. Nyarlathotep made his first appearance in the 1920 prose poem that bears his name, and from the very beginning, the method of his storytelling broke from tradition. There is no plot in Nyarlathotep, no conventional character arc. The narrator speaks in fragments, shifts in perception, scenes that dissolve, voices that echo but do not conclude. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell. This opening sets the tone. Historical certainty collapses immediately into rumor. Egypt evokes antiquity, but none could tell dismantles the promise of origin. The god's entrance is not anchored in mythic history. It arrives through dream and disorientation. The prose poem is structured like a fevered recollection. The narrator wanders through a city drawn to Nyarlathotep's demonstrations, which combine science and spectacle. People gather to watch, hoping to understand. What they receive instead are images of destruction, and then silence. Civilization unravels not through cataclysm, but through cognitive withdrawal. "We were the only men on Earth," the narrator says, "and it was then I saw the crawling chaos that tore down the stars." That final line is pivotal. The destruction isn't spatial, it's symbolic. Stars, long associated with navigation, order, aspiration, are torn down. The cosmos becomes unreadable. The narrative function here is foundational. Nyarlathotep is introduced not as an actor in myth, but as a vector for disintegration. There is no antagonist to defeat, no mystery to solve. He moves through narrative as entropy moves through systems. Nyarlathotep is not a story, it is a transmission, and that form itself becomes part of his horror. Later appearances will adopt more traditional narrative framing, but this first glimpse sets the tone. Wherever he appears, structure will falter, genre will bend, meaning will erode. This erosion continues in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, though in a Eobdabam different register. Here, Nyarlathotep is the manipulator behind the scenes. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, journeys through the dreamlands in search of a mysterious city from his dreams. He encounters gods, monsters, landscapes of both beauty and dread. But when he finally reaches the gods of Earth, he finds they have fled from the city he desires. And Nyarlathotep, smiling, lucid, explains everything. But his explanations do not restore order. Instead, they destabilize Carter's identity. "You are not as other men," he tells him. "You are not flesh, but shadow and dream." Carter's quest becomes a trap. His destination becomes a loop. Here, Nyarlathotep's function is different. He is not the destroyer, but the revealer. He speaks in complete sentences. He offers logic. But what he reveals is the fiction of logic itself. In the dreamlands, reality conforms to perception, but that perception is manipulable. Nyarlathotep's words create coherence only long enough to undo it. The reader, like Carter, is seduced by narrative clarity, only to discover that the journey was a closed system. The story circles back on itself. The god has won not by violence, but by completion, by delivering the full arc and showing that it leads nowhere. In both stories, Nyarlathotep undermines the boundaries of narrative form. But this destabilization is more than literary play. It connects to the larger mythos by showing that myth itself is not stable. The gods of Lovecraft's world are not bound by mythic cycles. They do not teach lessons or model moral structures. They do not exist to explain. Nyarlathotep alone interacts, and that interaction corrupts the act of storytelling. His appearances become meta-narrative devices. His very presence signals that the story will not resolve. Closure is forbidden. Truth, once glimpsed, is displaced. These early manifestations also establish a trajectory. Later writers, Derleth, Lumley, Campbell, would expand on Nyarlathotep's forms and functions. But few retain the corrosive narrative ambiguity of Lovecraft's originals. The prose poem and dream quest are not merely entries in a canon. They are blueprints for collapse. Each appearance of Nyarlathotep introduces uncertainty, not just about plot or character, but about the act of reading. His stories are not content. They are mechanisms, rituals of disintegration performed through text. The evolution of Nyarlathotep begins here, but it does not end. In later tales, his presence will become more literal, more embodied, more theatrical. But his essence remains unchanged. He is the speaker who should not speak, the presence that delivers understanding and leaves only silence. As we now move to analyze individual case studies, we will see how his presence mutates through different narrative environments, always adapted, always shifting, but always leaving the same result: stories that cannot hold themselves together. Let us continue. One of you. The most intricate manifestations of Nyarlathotep appears in The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, a story often misread as simple occult horror. On the surface, it follows a familiar Lovecraftian structure: a brilliant but overreaching student, arcane knowledge, and a descent into madness. But beneath this plot lies a more insidious mechanism. Nyarlathotep is not just a background figure. He is the orchestrator of collapse, embedded in mathematics, architecture, and dream. Here, he no longer walks through cities delivering visions. Instead, he waits in the folds of non-Euclidean space and dreams just adjacent to waking life. Walter Gilman, the protagonist, studies advanced mathematics and folklore at Miskatonic University. He rents a room in the infamous witch house, said to have angles which hurt the eyes. From the beginning, the geometry of the space functions as a portal. Gilman begins dreaming not in metaphor, but in transit. He visits strange realms of utter blackness, where symbols precede understanding. In these dreams, he meets two entities: Kezia Mason, a resurrected witch, and her familiar, Brown Jenkin. But behind them looms a third presence, obscure at first, then unmistakable. Nyarlathotep, described as the Black Man of the Witch's Sabbath, speaks in forms the dream barely contains. The story draws from real-world folklore about the Black Man in early modern witch trials, often used as a euphemism for the devil. Lovecraft repurposes the term, but strips it of Christian moral structure. This devil does not promise damnation or salvation. He offers equations. Gilman hears formulae chanted as rituals, feels symbols burned into his flesh. The horror is not supernatural in the traditional sense. It is epistemological. Science and magic merge, collapsing their difference. Nyarlathotep is not lurking in ancient texts alone. He is encoded in physics. He reveals that understanding the universe is not a blessing, but a vector for exposure. One key moment underscores this horror. Gilman dreams of an immense abyss where voices chant in a language beyond phonetics. He is told he will be taken to the throne of Azathoth, and that Nyarlathotep will guide him. This journey never fully occurs in waking reality, yet its consequences manifest physically. Gilman awakens with cuts on his chest, symbols he could not describe. The boundary between dream and body has failed. This collapse is essential. Nyarlathotep's power lies not in violating the laws of reality, but in demonstrating that those laws are already porous. Gilman's final descent is not triggered by fear, but by understanding. He begins to see the angles everywhere. He senses patterns in music, in architecture, in numbers. He begins to perceive beyond dimensional constraints. And in that expansion, the mind does not grow. It fractures. There was no mark on the wall, Lovecraft writes, but Gilman could have sworn that he had seen something dark and uncoiled slip silently out of the room. This image matters. Nyarlathotep's exit is as quiet as his entry. No violence, no confrontation, just departure. The damage is already done. Narratively, the story reframes Nyarlathotep as the mathematics of collapse. He does not act as an antagonist in the traditional sense. He does not even appear for most of the story. His presence is cumulative, a growing pressure of implication. When he does emerge, it is as confirmation of a process already completed. Gilman was not corrupted. He arrived at knowledge, at truth, at the threshold of systems that will not hold him. This shift in role, from character to inevitability, marks an evolution in Lovecraft's handling of the figure. The dreams in the witch house ties Nyarlathotep into modern anxieties, the merging of science and mysticism, the danger of unchecked inquiry, the thin veil between logic and madness. but it also pushes his myth further. He is not just a trickster or messenger. He is embedded infrastructure, the collapse waiting inside geometry, language, and dreams. In this role, he ceases to be a mythological entity and becomes something worse, a principle hiding in plain sight. As we turn next to the Haunter of the Dark, we will see this evolution continue. Nyarlathotep will become less visible, more suggestive, yet even more present. His form may vanish, but his effect deepens. The story becomes the residue of his passing. Let us look more closely at what remains when he is gone. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, Nyarlathotep assumes his most elusive form, one that barely appears, yet saturates every frame of the narrative. This story, Lovecraft's last major work before his death, distills Nyarlathotep's horror into its purest expression, presence by absence. Here, he does not walk among crowds or speak in dreams. He does not wear human faces or tempt with logic. He waits, silent, light-sensitive, unseen. But his influence infects the story's space, its architecture, its very structure. In this subtle recursion, he becomes not just a character within the story, but the shape of the story itself. The plot follows Robert Blake, a writer and seeker of the esoteric, who discovers a mysterious church in Providence. Abandoned, decaying, and sealed, the church once belonged to the Church of Starry Wisdom, a cult associated with strange disappearances and unspeakable rites. Inside, Blake finds the shining trapezohedron, a multifaceted stone of impossible angles that glows with inner light and induces visions. From the moment he sees it, Blake is marked. He knew that he had looked upon some ultimate horror, Lovecraft writes, and that this horror had looked back. This line is crucial. The gaze is reciprocal. Observation invites attention. The being summoned through the trapezohedron is known only as the Haunter of the Dark, a shadowy, winged form that cannot tolerate light. But Lovecraft embeds an unmistakable detail. The Haunter of the Dark is said to be the avatar of Nyarlathotep. The implication is devastating. This isn't a fragment of Nyarlathotep. It's his local presence, his condensation into a form suitable for a decaying church and a curious mind. That localization should not be reassuring. It is precisely what allows him to enter the narrative so completely. Unlike in The Dreams in the Witch House, where Nyarlathotep speaks, here he acts through implication. Blake becomes obsessed with the church. He sketches strange architecture. He dreams of the void between stars. He begins to suspect that something is watching him through the trapezohedron. Yet the horror is not sudden. It accumulates. Each return to the church deepens his exposure. He writes in his journal of seeing vast black wings and eyes that burn. But we never see these directly. The story remains structured around absences. Blake's absences from his room, the missing journal entries, the power outage that finally allows the Haunter to move. This restraint is not omission. It is design. The Haunter's final arrival is described only through implication. As the city is plunged into darkness by a lightning storm, Blake is trapped in his room, powerless, watching the shadows approach. I see it, coming here, hellwind, titan blur, black wings, Yog-Sothoth, save me, the three-lobed burning eye. These are his final words, scrawled in a trembling hand. There's no description of death, only the remnants of witnessing. The three-lobed burning eye connects back to other references of Nyarlathotep's avatars, a signature, not a form. The story ends not with revelation, but with Blake's disappearance and the authorities' inability to explain what occurred. Narratively, this story refines Nyarlathotep's function. He is not a participant. He is the condition of the story's unraveling. The church, the stone, the dreams. They are all expressions of his presence. The horror lies in proximity, the idea that one can almost reach truth, can almost see the figure in the dark. But there is no clarity, only recursion. Blake's knowledge does not illuminate, it attracts, and what it attracts cannot be escaped. This structure echoes across the mythos. The shining trapezohedron becomes an object referenced in later stories and games, an archetypal conduit for cosmic contagion. But few adaptations preserve its ambiguity. The haunter is often visualized, literalized. What Lovecraft understood, and what is so easily lost, is that Nyarlathotep's horror is maximal when minimized. His most frightening form is the one that does not arrive fully, but instead presses on the edge of perception. The haunter of the dark therefore marks a culmination. Nyarlathotep is no longer the dream speaker or Sabbath god. He is no longer symbolic or allegorical. He has become residual. His form is absent, but the story bends around him. This evolution does not dilute him, it concentrates him. As we turn next to the work of Lovecraft's collaborators and inheritors, we must ask, could anyone else sustain this level of restraint? Or did the expansion of the myth inevitably flatten the god it tried to explain? Let us examine what happened when others took up the name Nyarlathotep, and what was lost in the process. When August Derleth assumed the role of Lovecraft's literary executor, he brought with him a desire for structure. Derleth saw in Lovecraft's work the raw material of a grand mythology and attempted to organize it along familiar theological lines: a war between good and evil, order and chaos, elemental forces and moral consequences. In doing so, he recast the entities of the mythos into a taxonomy: great old ones as malevolent, elder gods as their benevolent opposites. Nyarlathotep, under this scheme, became a lieutenant of cosmic evil, a sort of demonic functionary in a universal hierarchy. This was not a reinterpretation, it was a reduction. The consequences of this shift were significant. Derleth's system imposed coherence where Lovecraft had insisted on fracture. It introduced intention to beings that were previously defined by indifference. Nyarlathotep became the soul and messenger of the outer gods, not in the ambiguous philosophical sense, but as an agent of a cosmic battle. In stories like The Dweller in Darkness, he appears as a shapeshifter and tormentor, but one whose actions serve narrative clarity. The horror here becomes goal-oriented. His appearances are punishments. His words contain threat rather than collapse. The ambiguity that once defined him is replaced by purpose. Later writers extended this trend. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow novels present Nyarlathotep as a recurring adversary. Powerful, certainly, but increasingly theatrical. He takes on forms more reminiscent of fantasy villains than cosmic enigmas. Dialogue becomes more direct, conflict more literal. In this rendering, Nyarlathotep loses his structural function and becomes a character, defeatable, trackable, almost predictable. The reader may still fear him, but they understand the shape of that fear. The unknowable has become known, and with that, the horror is contained. In gaming, especially in Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, Nyarlathotep becomes a highly versatile antagonist. Game materials portray him in numerous masks, from the Black Pharaoh to the Bloody Tongue, to avatars tailored for specific regions and time periods. This flexibility preserves a key feature of his original conception: multiplicity. But the game format necessitates interaction. Nyarlathotep must be given goals, motives, mechanics. He must appear on cue, affect outcomes, respond to player actions. This makes him narratively useful, but ontologically smaller. He becomes, paradoxically, more powerful and less terrifying. One partial exception is Ramsey Campbell, whose contributions to the mythos retain some of Nyarlathotep's ambiguity. In stories like The Render of the Veils, Campbell captures the idea that perception itself can become hazardous. His Nyarlathotep is not just a monster, but a mechanism for shifting reality. Still, even here, there is a tendency toward local mythology, specific cults, and identifiable rituals. The figure is eerie, but increasingly folkloric, bound to place and story rather than unmoored chaos. These expansions reflect a broader tension in myth-making. To preserve Nyarlathotep's original horror requires restraint, a willingness to leave the god partially undefined. But shared storytelling, especially in pulp and game contexts, tends to fill in gaps. Gaps become lore, lore becomes canon, and canon calcifies ambiguity into structure. The god who once represented the collapse of systems becomes a fixture within a system. It is worth noting that Lovecraft himself never developed a full cosmology. He discouraged rigid interpretation. His entities overlapped, contradicted, evolved. Nyarlathotep appears in several forms and contexts, often disconnected. That inconsistency is not a flaw. It is thematic. It mirrors the collapse of stable meaning. Later writers often miss this. They treat Nyarlathotep as a fixed being who assumes many forms, rather than as a form of collapse that wears identities only to undo them. What remains, then, is a figure whose essence is best preserved in suggestion. Attempts to explain him, whether theological, narrative, or ludic, almost always diminish him. The most effective later uses of Nyarlathotep tend to be those that return to his function, not his form. He is the infection of certainty, the voice that hollows out meaning, the interface between comprehension and madness. Not a villain, not a god, not even a character, but a philosophical device wearing the skin of narrative. As we move into the cultural and psychological afterlife of Nyarlathotep in Part 4, we must ask what it means that his name persists, not just in stories, but in games, memes, music, and whispered conspiracies. How does a figure designed to collapse meaning continue to generate meaning across generations? What happens when the god of epistemic erosion becomes a cultural icon? Let us follow that trajectory into the fractured landscape of modern horror. Nyarlathotep's afterlife does not unfold through belief, but through rumor. Online spaces are filled with accounts of dream encounters, invented cults, and sightings, framed as jokes that hesitate too long before laughter. Message boards circulate faux archaeological claims and fabricated grimoires, often tagged as fiction, yet discussed with obsessive seriousness. This ambiguity is the point. Nyarlathotep thrives where sincerity and irony blur. Urban legends surrounding him rarely assert truth. They imply possibility. That implication is enough. The god persists not as a figure people worship, but as a narrative, virus, one that spreads through speculation, parody, and unease, reinforcing the idea that belief itself is unstable. In visual media, Nyarlathotep appears most often by omission. Films and games influenced by him avoid direct depiction, favoring atmosphere and implication. Bloodborne borrows his logic without his name. Insight increases perception while destroying sanity. The secret world presents him as a global manipulator whose faces adapt to culture and era. Music, particularly industrial and black metal, invokes him as a symbol of intelligible collapse, a voice behind systems that promise order while accelerating decay. These adaptations rarely explain him. They understand intuitively that explanation weakens him. Presence without clarity preserves dread. Subcultures have also claimed Nyarlathotep as metaphor. In chaos magic, he appears as a symbol of mutable identity and belief as tool rather than truth. In internet meme culture, he becomes the god of misinformation, ironic detachment, and recursive jokes. This is not dilution, it is evolution. Nyarlathotep adapts because he was never fixed. He survives translation into new media because his essence is not narrative, but function. Wherever systems of meaning circulate faster than understanding, his shape emerges, not as deity, but as pattern. Academic discourse has likewise engaged him, often indirectly. Cultural theorists reference Lovecraft's figures when discussing post-truth dynamics, information overload, and the collapse of grand narratives. Nyarlathotep becomes shorthand for persuasive systems that erode trust in reality itself. Unlike Cthulhu, who symbolizes overwhelming scale, Nyarlathotep represents cognitive sabotage. He is cited in discussions of propaganda, charismatic authority, and algorithmic persuasion. These are not superficial parallels. They reflect a shared anxiety that the greatest threat is not falsehood, but coherence weaponized against comprehension. Why does this figure persist when so many others fade? Because Nyarlathotep addresses a universal fear that grows stronger with time. The fear that understanding is not protective. Human cultures have long assumed that knowledge grants control. Nyarlathotep suggests the opposite, that deeper understanding may expose flaws in perception itself. This is not nihilism for its own sake. It is a confrontation with limits. The god endures because he articulates a suspicion modern life reinforces daily, that systems speak fluently while meaning erodes beneath them. There is also a psychological dimension. Nyarlathotep externalizes the experience of recognizing one's own cognitive vulnerability. He embodies the moment when trust in language, memory, or expertise fractures. This is why he appears during transitions, technological, political, epistemic. He does not cause these ruptures, he inhabits them. His persistence across media reflects the persistence of those conditions. As long as humans seek certainty in unstable systems, his outline will remain visible. What remains unresolved is whether Nyarlathotep is merely a metaphor or something more enduring. Not a literal entity, but a recurring configuration of fear, language, and collapse. Lovecraft left this open, perhaps deliberately, because to define him fully would be to neutralize him, and so he persists, not as a god to be believed in, but as an idea that refuses to settle, an echo that continues wherever meaning feels close, but never quite reachable. Nyarlathotep's presence in modern media resists fixation. Unlike more iconic horror figures, those with masks, motifs, and origin stories, he refuses visual crystallization. When he does appear in film or games, he's rarely shown directly. This absence is not a limitation of budget or format. It is thematic fidelity. His horror lies in suggestion, not spectacle. In the 2015 video game Bloodborne, for example, the concept of insight mirrors his epistemic function. The more the player sees, the more the world reveals its grotesque truth, and the more fragile the player becomes. There is no final revelation, only an expanding awareness that perception itself is a trap. In The Secret World, an MMORPG centered on occult conspiracies, Nyarlathotep appears as a being behind the global filth, a substance that corrupts language, perception, and logic. His avatars shift from sinister prophets to media moguls to viral memes. This multiplicity reflects his literary role, a god who wears culture like a skin. The game never fully shows him. Instead, players fight his influences, his manifestations as distortion. What is being resisted is not power, but collapse. Victory never brings resolution, only postponement. Music, too, has absorbed his image, particularly in genres that flirt with the esoteric and the chaotic. Bands such as The Axis of Perdition and Portal invoke him as a force of dissolution. Their lyrics are abstract, fragmented, mirroring his impact. Rather than telling stories, these songs perform disintegration. The listener is not invited to follow a narrative, but to experience breakdown. This is consistent with Nyarlathotep's mythic function. He is not a subject within art, but a force acting upon its form. Music becomes medium and victim. Even more mainstream texts carry his influence obliquely. Characters like the Joker, in his more metaphysical incarnations, Pennywise and Hannibal Lecter channel aspects of Nyarlathotep, not as adaptations, but as echoes. They are charismatic, articulate, theatrical. They offer clarity with an undercurrent of entropy. What they reveal is never what it seems, and behind their eloquence is an invitation, not to understand, but to dismantle understanding. These figures, like Nyarlathotep, offer language as bait. Attempts to literalize him, however, often weaken the horror. When Nyarlathotep is visualized, as in some tabletop game art, comics, or fan adaptations, he tends to become grotesque but comprehensible, tentacled, robed, humanoid. These depictions mistake his essence for his effect. The fear he inspires does not come from form, but from function. He is not monstrous in appearance, but an implication. To show him fully is to betray the concept. The best adaptations recognize this and opt for suggestion. Distorted signals, corrupted texts, glimpses through unreliable narrators. This adaptability explains why he endures across mediums. Unlike fixed icons of horror, Nyarlathotep adapts to format-specific fears. In games, he embodies corrupted systems and choice without control. In film, he appears through atmosphere and disorientation. In music, he becomes tone and texture. Each medium reinterprets him through its own vulnerabilities. He requires no canon, only collapse. His myth does not persist because it is told, but because it can be retold, differently, and always incompletely. Ultimately, his appearances across film, games, and music speak less to fidelity and more to resonance. The specifics change. The core does not. He remains the voice that speaks too clearly, the presence that destabilizes the frame, the pattern that erases as it reveals. His cultural adaptations confirm what Lovecraft hinted all along. Nyarlathotep does not reside in any one world. He moves between them, and what he carries is not horror alone, but the slow undoing of what horror means. Nyarlathotep's influence extends far beyond fiction. He has become a symbol within subcultures and academic discourse alike, used to explore themes of collapse, cognition, and the instability of meaning. In these spaces, he no longer appears as a character, but as a conceptual tool, not who he is, but what he represents. Subcultures adopt him not because they believe in his literal existence, but because he offers a frame for articulating breakdowns of identity, of knowledge, of cultural coherence. His shape is mutable. His function is constant. In online occult communities, particularly those aligned with chaos magic, Nyarlathotep has been reimagined as a deity of paradox and misinformation. Practitioners treat him less as an object of veneration and more as a symbolic disruptor. In these frameworks, he represents the conscious use of belief as tool rather than truth. Belief in belief. Invoking Nyarlathotep becomes an act of epistemic rebellion, a way to unseat internalized certainty. Rituals involving him often center not on summoning, but on disorientation. Language loops, contradictory mantras, thought exercises that leave the practitioner uncertain whether anything occurred at all. That ambiguity is the goal. In internet meme culture, he appears in layered irony. Images of Nyarlathotep circulate alongside cryptic text and glitch art, often without context. These posts operate on two levels: surface-level absurdity and deeper recognition of something wrong beneath. He is sometimes called the god of viral misinformation, a being who speaks only in content that sounds profound but erodes meaning on contact. This role mirrors how online spaces function, as places of signal without clarity, where participation replaces understanding. Nyarlathotep thrives in environments saturated with language yet emptied of coherence. Academia has not ignored this symbolic flexibility. Scholars in media studies, philosophy, and cultural criticism reference Nyarlathotep when analyzing systems that simulate communication but produce alienation. He becomes shorthand for persuasive systems with no stable content: propaganda machines, algorithmic feeds, charismatic authorities whose speech carries affect but resists interpretation. In this view, Nyarlathotep is not a mythic figure, but a structural condition, a symptom of what happens when language performs fluently while meaning collapses behind it. Notably, some scholars have used him to interrogate their own methodologies. What does it mean, they ask, to study horror using tools that horror itself claims are inadequate? In articles and symposia, Nyarlathotep becomes a symbol of scholarly limit, the moment when interpretation becomes entangled in the very systems it seeks to decode. The figure becomes a challenge to objectivity, to reason, to analysis itself. This metacritical use is rare in other mythos figures. Cthulhu may evoke scale, Azathoth chaos, but only Nyarlathotep speaks back. Even political commentary occasionally invokes his name. Satirists and theorists alike draw parallels between his masks and the performance of authority in post-truth culture. He becomes a metaphor for the figure who always adapts, always persuades, but never clarifies. This isn't merely poetic. It reflects an anxiety central to modern life, that power today operates not through force, but through over-communication. Nyarlathotep, as a symbol, fits seamlessly into critiques of systems where language obscures rather than reveals. What links all these appropriations is their refusal to settle. Whether in chaos ritual, meme culture, or academic citation, Nyarlathotep does not resolve into a consistent meaning. He resists ownership. He thrives in multiplicity. That persistence reveals something about the modern psyche, a growing recognition that the world no longer coheres through single narratives. In that fractured epistemology, Nyarlathotep endures, not because he is believed, but because he mirrors the condition of belief itself. Nyarlathotep endures not as myth, but as symptom. His survival across a century of shifting media, ideologies, and anxieties reveals something deeper than literary influence. He is not simply a character from a strange corner of weird fiction. He is the embodiment of a psychological condition that has become increasingly familiar. the sense that reality is not only unknowable, but actively deceptive. His function is not to terrify with spectacle, but to whisper the possibility that understanding itself may be a trap. At the heart of his persistence lies a fundamental philosophical tension, the collapse of interpretive certainty. In Lovecraft's time, this manifested through the crumbling authority of religion, the rise of relativistic science, and the disorienting emergence of a global, industrialized modernity. Today, it takes different shapes: algorithmic feeds that manipulate perception, media ecosystems that fracture consensus, technologies that blur real and simulated experience. Nyarlathotep speaks to all of these, not by offering a message, but by eroding the conditions under which messages can be trusted. He is not a liar. He is the suggestion that truth has always been performative. This psychological disruption is not dramatic. It is slow, creeping, often unnoticed. Those touched by him in stories rarely scream. They drift, withdraw, vanish. In this way, Nyarlathotep externalizes a distinctly modern form of dread: derealization. The sense that the world continues to operate, but with its substance hollowed out. The forms remain: language, ritual, order, but they no longer anchor us. His victims don't lose their minds in the conventional sense. They lose the assumption that their minds ever corresponded to reality. That shift is irreversible. He also embodies the dread of clarity. Most horror thrives in shadows, in the unknown. Nyarlathotep does the opposite. He speaks, he explains, but his explanations open no door. They expose the absence of doorways. He is the god of too much knowledge, the one who teaches not by concealing, but by revealing the futility of understanding. His gift is overexposure. His miracle is the collapse of questions. To listen is to dissolve. This inversion has psychological consequences. It confronts a core human need, the desire for patterns. The brain is a machine for finding coherence across symbols, sensations, language. Nyarlathotep disrupts this mechanism by supplying false patterns with devastating precision. He offers symbols that seem to fit until they don't, meanings that feel stable until they multiply. The damage he causes is not immediate. It grows slowly, like doubt. And once doubt takes root in the mechanism of thought, nothing remains untouched. What does it mean that a fictional god has become a cultural constant, invoked in moments of crisis, collapse, or confusion? It means that the figure was never truly fictional, not in the literal sense, but in the structural one. Nyarlathotep was designed to inhabit the cracks in systems: theological, linguistic, psychological. Those cracks have only widened. In a world saturated with information and drained of coherence, he is more than a mythos entity. He is a mirror, and yet he is not final. He promises no apocalypse. He offers no end. That too is part of the horror. The voice continues. The masks shift. The system loops. Nyarlathotep persists because the need to listen, to understand, persists. Even when we know it, leads nowhere. We conclude without resolution, because resolution is foreign to him. There is no closing ritual, no final confrontation, no safe return. There is only this lingering awareness that something has spoken, and what it said cannot be unheard. The story does not end. It remains.